Like Cumberland Mountains sit quiet in late October, not peaceful, quiet the way things go quiet before something breaks. The trees have already given up their leaves. The gravel roads into Calhoun County, Alabama run thin and pale between walls of bare timber, and if you follow them far enough north, past the Baptist church, past the feed store, past the town that stopped growing in 1987 and decided that was fine, you find a farm that has been waiting. Red brick, deep porch, a pecan tree on the south side with a bench beneath it tilted into the ground at one leg, as if someone sat there long enough to leave a mark. The farmhouse has been locked for 4 months. Inside a kitchen drawer, a property tax notice is due in 90 days. In a law office in Anniston, a brass key has just changed hands. And beneath the kitchen floor of that farmhouse, behind a section of pine planking that does not quite sit level with the rest, something has been waiting far longer than 4 months. A woman is driving north, does not know yet what is under that floor, but the key is in her hand. Ever watched someone hand you the smallest piece at the table and smile while they did it, and know, in your bones, that they were more relieved than they were generous? There is a key, brass, old, sitting on a lawyer's conference table in Anniston, Alabama, on the last Thursday of October, looking like something pulled from a junk drawer and not thought about twice. Except the woman at the far end of that table, the one in pressed slacks and a plain white blouse, the one nobody in the room quite made eye contact with. She was looking at that key, like it was the only honest thing in the building. Her name is Stephanie Harris. She is 25 years old, white, with brown hair she keeps in a low ponytail and a face that has learned, over a long time, not to let itself do things that other people can use against her. Drove 4 hours from Baton Rouge that morning, left at 5:15 while the city was still dark and humid, took I-20 east through the long flat pull of Mississippi and into Alabama, watched the landscape slowly remember it had hills, a thermos of coffee and a podcast she did not listen to, and her work badge from the Baton Rouge Parish Records Office in her wallet, because she always had her work badge in her wallet. Clerk too, the kind of job where your name was on the badge, but the badge was really just a reason to access the building. If you law offices of Lewis and Cummins occupied the second floor of a building on Noble Street that had been a bank in a previous life. Architecture still carried that old institutional confidence, marble-veined flooring, wood-paneled walls, windows tall enough to make you feel small without quite meaning to. Jeffrey Lewis ran a clean, careful practice. Had handled Raymond Harris's estate documents for 11 years and had read versions of this will 6 times before today, including twice to himself that morning, which was why he could read it now without visible feeling about any of it. That was a skill. Stephanie recognized it. She had developed her own version over a long time and respected it in other people. She arrived at Lewis and Cummins at 9:47. Receptionist said the other parties were already in the conference room. Other parties. Specific phrasing. She noted it. Ryan Robinson Harris had taken the chair closest to Jeffrey Lewis and brought a yellow legal pad. H told Stephanie most of what she needed to know about Ryan Robinson Harris within 45 seconds of entering the room. He was 44, wide through the shoulders, the kind of man who described himself as straightforward and meant it as a compliment. Based equipment leasing company in Anniston, had 14 employees and a regional contract with a farm supply chain that he had been mentioning to Jeffrey during the pre-meeting small talk. Stephanie caught the tail end of as she pushed open the conference room door. Aide Gary Young sat beside him. 39, quieter in the way that men are quiet when they are aware of something they would prefer not to examine too closely. His hands on the table were still and deliberate, the hands of someone who worked outdoors and had stopped trying to hide it. Margaret Robinson Harris sat across from them on the window side, powder blue blazer, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, posture calibrated to the image of composed widowhood with such precision that it read less like grief and more like a studied position. She looked at Stephanie when Stephanie entered. Once. The kind of look that takes a measurement and stores it. Looked back at the window. Stephanie took the chair at the far end of the table because it was the only one left, and because it was where she had been placed her entire life. She put her bag on the floor. She put her hands on the table, waited, Jeffrey Lewis began at 10 o'clock on the mark. He read without editorial coloring, moving through the distribution of Raymond Harris's estate, the way a careful man moves through a legal document when he wants the facts to carry their own weight. Ian received the equipment leasing rights and the Aniston rental property on Caldwell Street. Gary received the active farming lease agreements, the remaining cattle operation assets, and the outbuilding contents. Margaret received the townhouse on Hillier Avenue, the furniture, the savings accounts totaling $740,000, and Raymond's truck. Ryan uncapped his pen and made a note on the legal pad. The scratch of it was the only sound in the room besides Jeffrey's voice. Then Jeffrey cleared his throat. The Harris family farm. 380 acres, Calhoun County. The farmhouse and all outbuildings and any contents therein, left in its entirety to Stephanie Ann Harris. Ryan set down his pen. He did not laugh. He was too careful for that. Instead, he picked the pen back up, the exact same pen, exact same unhurried motion, and wrote something on the legal pad that Stephanie, from the far end of the table, could not read. Whatever it was, he underlined it. Gary did not move at all, studying the surface of the table in front of him with the fixed attention of a person concentrating very hard on not having a visible reaction. Margaret's hands, folded on top of the table, pressed together slightly at the knuckles, slightly. Then she smoothed her blazer once and let her hands fall to her lap. Jeffrey slid a manila folder down the table toward Stephanie inside. The deed, a property survey dated 3 years earlier, a single brass key on a plain ring, a sealed envelope, cream-colored, Stephanie's name in handwriting she did not recognize as her father's because she had very few samples to compare it against. Marked in dark ink, to be opened by Stephanie Harris only, not here. At the farm, she picked up the key. It sat in her palm heavier than she expected. When she opened the folder to look at the deed, she saw what Raymond Harris had written by hand on the inside cover, added after the legal typing was already done, handwriting that pressed harder into the paper than the rest of the document did. 4 words. She will know why. Nobody asked Jeffrey what they meant. They were not looking at her folder. The hallway outside the conference room had the particular quality of institutional quiet that exists to absorb uncomfortable sounds. Stephanie was near the elevator, her bag on her shoulder, the folder under her arm. Heard Ryan's voice from the other side of the conference room door. Not the words, just the register. Even, professional. Already moving past the event and organizing what came next. She took the stairs. It. She bought a coffee she didn't need from the cart in the lobby, and stood near the window for 3 minutes watching Noble Street through the glass, thinking about how she was supposed to feel. Construct the feeling theoretically. Something like validation. The father who had been absent leaving her something, a recognition of some kind. A 380-acre farm with an unpainted porch and a structural evaluation note on one of the outbuildings was not the same as a relationship, and she was clear-eyed enough to know that. Ryan came through the lobby 10 minutes later, Gary a step behind. Ryan stopped when he saw her. That small recalculation behind the eyes that meant he had planned this conversation and was now executing it. The farm had been unworked for 4 years. That fencing was down on the south and west sides. That the roof over the east wing needed attention. He said it carefully. Needing attention, not leaking, and it was probably leaking. He said there were 2 years of unpaid property taxes, and the county would begin lien proceedings if they weren't resolved by January 31st. He said he already had a contact at a land management company that handled agricultural acquisitions in Calhoun County. A direct sale, clean, proceeds split according to the air structure Raymond had established. Then he gave her the number, $7,000 in back taxes, due January 31st. She asked how much the land management company would offer. Ryan said that depended on the assessment, parcels in Calhoun County had recently moved between $400,000 and $500,000. She nodded slowly and told him she would think about it. He gave her his card. The offer window was 30 days, which was not an accident. 30 days got her to the end of November, the tax deadline still 6 weeks out, pressure operating but not yet visible enough to feel coercive. He was good at this. Tossed his card in her jacket pocket and shook his hand and watched him, and Gary crossed the lobby and pushed through the glass doors. Gary checking his phone, Ryan already talking. Then she looked at the brass key in her other hand. They sat in the parking structure on the third floor for 11 minutes, counted without meaning to. The envelope was on the passenger seat, to be opened by Stephanie Harris only. Not here, at the farm. Raymond Harris had known she would sit somewhere and think about going back. They had known it well enough to specify where she should open the thing. Not at the attorney's office, where the room was still charged with the presence of people who had more claim on that space than she did, but in a parking structure in Anniston. At the farm, specifically, he had been thinking about how she thought. The understanding of that sat in her chest like something that could not decide yet whether it was going to be grief or something else. Exited the car. She put the farm address into the GPS. She followed it north. The drive from Anniston into Calhoun County ran through a landscape that became less interested in commerce as it went. The fast food clusters and strip malls giving way to feed stores and Baptist churches and long stretches of timber that had been cut and was coming back in second growth. Thin new trees packed close together along the ridgeline. The GPS took her off the state highway onto a county road, then off the county road onto a paved single lane, then off the paved single lane onto something that was gravel and intention. She passed through Delwood 3 miles before the farm address appeared. Population 380, according to the sign. A hardware store on the corner, a diner with a hand-painted sandwich board, pharmacy and a post office sharing a parking lot, a volunteer fire station with its bay doors up. The hardware store had a sign above the door. White's Hardware and Feed, Est 1961. She pulled over. She had a property map from the attorney's office, but the farm road was not labeled clearly on it. Learned from a decade working with county documents that the paper reality and the navigable reality of rural land disagreed with each other in ways that mattered. The bell above the door of White's Hardware and Feed was the old mechanical kind. Its sound more clunk than chime. The store smelled of seed and lubricant and the particular drywood smell of a building that had been in continuous use for 60 years and knew its own smell by now. Display shelves ran to the back in narrow rows, hardware in the front half and agricultural supply toward the back. An older man was near the front window stacking bags of winter seed mix on a low shelving unit. He was 70-something, white-haired, like a man who had spent decades doing physical work and had not entirely stopped. He turned when the bell rang. He looked at Stephanie. He put down the bag of seed, not with alarm, not with confusion. A specific stillness of a person encountering something they have been thinking about for a while and were not entirely sure they would live to see. Stephanie said she was looking for the Harris farm. She had inherited it. As Raymond Harris's daughter, he said yes, he knew, without surprise, without performance. The same way you'd say yes when someone confirms something you have been waiting on. His name was George White, and he had known Raymond Harris since they were 17 years old, both of them at the same Calhoun County High School. The kind of fact that happened in places where people stayed. The geography held people in relation to each other for decades without them necessarily choosing it. He told her Raymond came to Delwood the first Saturday of every month for 30 years. Sometimes for seed or hardware, sometimes for nothing he could have named. He always stopped at the counter, and he always at some point in the conversation mentioned Stephanie. She went. Very still, she said, "He barely knew me." But George looked at her. With the patience of a man who had watched a lot of things unfold over 7 decades and had learned to tell the difference between a statement and a question that didn't know how to be one yet. He said, "That depends on what you mean by no." He drew her directions to the farm on the back of a feed receipt, his handwriting large and practiced. The county route, then the gravel lane, the rusted iron gate. Told her the gate's chain was looped but not locked. Raymond had stopped locking it years ago. Then he told her one more thing. He said about 12 years ago, Raymond had asked him to drive to one of Stephanie's foster placements in Gadsden. Raymond had put together a birthday package, a book and a letter, and wanted someone to hand it to her directly. Didn't trust the mail. George had driven to the group home on Hazel Street on a November afternoon with the package. A woman answered the door, not staff. Someone with the specific familiarity of a person who had been there before. The woman told him Stephanie was not available for outside contact. Ike said there was a legal restriction on unsolicited communications with the child. Told him to leave the package with her. George had looked at the woman, had looked at the package. Something felt wrong. Drove back to Delwood with the package on his passenger seat. Gave it back to Raymond the following Saturday. Raymond had sat in his truck for a long time without getting out. Then he got out and bought a box of nails he didn't need. Like George never asked him about it. Some things you understand without asking when you have known someone long enough to read the quiet correctly. Stephanie pushed the store door open and walked out into November air that was sharper than Baton Rouge had been, the sky doing the low pale work of late October in Alabama. She stood on the sidewalk. Ike not asked George who the woman at the door had been. She already knew. She had known for the last 30 seconds of standing in that store. And she understood for the first time that what she was driving toward was not a piece of property with a leaking roof and a tax problem. It was something that had been waiting to be found for a long time by a specific person, and she was the specific person. The gravel lane ran to the Harris farm through a screen of old pecan trees doing their November thing, dropping hulls that her tires rolled over with a sound like small things breaking. Rounded the tree line and the farm came into view in stages. First the cattle barn, large, weathered, oaf going orange at the edges with rust, but structurally intact, the way good construction stays intact, even when nobody is paying attention. Then 2 smaller outbuildings, then the farmhouse itself. Red brick, 2 stories, a deep porch running the full width of the front. The mortar between the bricks had weathered to that particular gray that old brick gets after 100 Alabama summers. One section of porch railing was missing. The east wing's roofline sagged slightly where Ryan had said it would. A second-floor window had a crack in the upper pane taped over with electrical tape, probably years ago, none of which was the thing Stephanie noticed first. First was the pecan tree on the south side of the house, old wide. The kind of tree that had been there before the house was built around it. Someone had put a wooden bench beneath it, weathered to gray, legs sunk into the ground, giving it a lean that looked not broken but resting. Raymond had sat there. She knew it the way you know certain things. No evidence, just the quality of the placement. The bench faced the south field, longest view on the property. She turned off the engine, sat for a moment in the quiet, which was a different kind than the city produced. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of sounds that did not compete. Wind, lighting moving in the tree line, the tick of her cooling engine. She got out of the car, walked to the front door. The brass key went into the lock with a precision that was almost startling. Not stiff, not fumbling, just correct. The lock turned. The door opened inward on hinges that moved without protest. The house smelled of old wood and dry plaster and something underneath those things that might have been tobacco. Not recent, not stale exactly, just absorbed into the walls over decades until it was less smell and more history. Furniture still in place, surfaces covered with a fine even layer of dust, the dust of a place that had been closed rather than abandoned. There was a difference and she recognized it. They ran along the back of the ground floor, a long wooden table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron wood stove against the east wall, open shelving with stacked plates and dry goods in labeled glass jars. Flour, cornmeal, salt. Labels were in Raymond's handwriting. She understood because they were the same careful hand as the folder cover. A man who documented everything would document his own pantry. She set her bag down by the kitchen table, put the sealed envelope in the center of the folder, and looked at it, to be opened by Stephanie Harris only, not here, at the farm. She was at the farm. Technically in compliance, she did not open it. Like some caution she couldn't name made her want to understand the space first, to walk it, to let the house be something she had looked at before she let it tell her what it had been holding. She walked them from floor, room by room, living room with a stone fireplace and a worn leather sofa and bookshelves along the east wall. Reference books, farm almanacs, a run of Louis L'Amour paperbacks handled many times, a Bible with a broken spine. Framed photographs on the mantel, Raymond at what looked like 35. Standing beside an older man in front of the south field, both squinting in the same direction, The posture between them so similar the genetic argument was visual and immediate. Other photograph of the farmhouse itself taken from the lane, decades earlier, the porch railing intact, the east wing roofline straight. A third, smaller photograph tucked to the side, Raymond standing alone at the edge of what appeared to be a county fair, a ribbon in his hand, looking pleased but slightly embarrassed about it. He had won something. He had cared about winning it. He had put the photograph where he could see it. These were small facts. They were also the first facts she had ever owned about Raymond Harris that were not filtered through official documentation. She found the staircase and walked the second floor. Bedrooms with iron frame beds and quilts that had been washed and left, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a radiator that knocked slightly when she tested the valve. A linen closet with folded blankets stacked in decreasing size, organized by someone with the patience to think about it. She went back downstairs, back to the kitchen, opened the kitchen drawers looking for a flashlight, found it in the third drawer where practical people kept flashlights. Found, same drawer, a piece of paper folded in thirds. Property tax notice, Calhoun County Revenue Commissioner. 2 years of unpaid taxes, final amount with penalties, $11,340. Notice of intent to file a county lien was paper-clipped to the back. Due date, January 31st. Ryan had given her the number at 11,000 flat in the parking structure, and he had looked at this notice recently enough to have it memorized, which meant he had been in this house. She refolded the notice along its original creases, photographed both pages on her phone, sent them to herself. Then she stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the room. November light was coming through the window above the sink at an angle, laying itself across the floor in long rectangles. Started a fire in the wood stove because the house was cold and she was going to sleep here. Found wood stacked in the mudroom, kindling in a bucket, matches on a shelf at eye level, ate from what was in the dry goods cabinet, pasta on the gas burner, salt, olive oil from a bottle still good. She sat at the kitchen table and ate and looked at the sealed envelope and thought about nothing in particular, a skill she had developed in group homes when thinking too specifically made the nights long. She was on the living room sofa, under blankets from the linen closet, when the sound came, small, not alarming. In the register of a house settling, a low creak from the direction of the kitchen. Not wind. She got up, crossed to the kitchen doorway, flashlight in hand, swept the beam across the room. Everything as she had left it. Table, chairs, soap on the folder, the stove cooling. Then she lowered the flashlight to the floor and let the beam run across the pine planks. Old wood with the irregularities of age. Variations in board width, nail heads at different heights, gaps refilled and refilled. She had walked this floor twice today and noticed none of it specifically because floors are what you stand on, except one section near the pantry door was different. A matter of a quarter-inch, right end of a board elevated slightly above the boards around it, the whole section sitting differently in its frame. She crossed to it and crouched down. Flashlight showed it clearly. A seam that ran in a rectangle roughly 2 boards wide by 3 boards long, filled with old dust and debris. She ran her fingers along the near edge and felt the interruption in the wood. A small iron ring, countersunk flush with the surface, nearly invisible against the dark pine. She would not have found it in daylight looking for it. She found it crouching close to the floor at 1 in the morning, with a flashlight at floor level, wrapped her fingers around the ring, pulled, left it on a concealed hinge, the boards moving as a single unit, the mechanism well built and not corroded. Someone had oiled it. Cold air came up from below, the specific cold of a stone space, underground, holding its temperature in isolation. Stone stairs, 6 of them, descending to a stone floor. The walls were foundation fieldstone, the same red-gray stone the farmhouse exterior was built on. The space below was not dirt floor. Aid had laid stone deliberately, squared it, built it to last. She went down. The room was larger than the stairs suggested, roughly the size of a bedroom, 14 feet by 18. Ceiling low enough that she had to step carefully. Akel's pull-cord light bulb that worked, meaning someone had run power down here at some point. Shelves on 3 walls from floor to ceiling, built from rough lumber but plumb and sound. On the shelves, composition notebooks in rows, organized by year, 31 of them she would eventually count, each labeled on the spine in black marker, wooden crates labeled with dates, a metal filing cabinet, 4 drawers, small padlock on the bottom drawer. At the center of the room, desk, wooden, plain, built rather than bought. One item on the desk, an envelope, cream-colored. Her name on the front in Raymond Harris's handwriting, marked, to be opened by Stephanie Harris only. She stopped moving. There were 2 envelopes. Diane Jeffrey Lewis had given her at the attorney's office was still upstairs on the kitchen table, unopened. Raymond had left 2, one with his attorney, to be given to her with the key. One down here, that could only be found by someone who came to the farm and spent time in the house and paid attention to a floor at 1 in the morning. He had built in a test, not a cruel one, a necessary one, like taken the key from Jeffrey and sold the farm through Ryan's contact without ever walking the property. The envelope upstairs would have gone to her, but this room would have remained sealed. If she had come for 1 day and turned around, same result. Only the person who stayed, only the person who came into the kitchen at 1 in the morning because something in the house was asking to be noticed. She crossed the room, sat down in the wooden chair beside the desk. Blake held the envelope for a moment. Outside, above her, the house was quiet. The mountains were doing whatever they did at night. She was sitting 12 feet below a farmhouse kitchen in Alabama, a room her father had built and stocked and kept secret for a long time, and the envelope in her hands had her name on it in his writing, and he was dead, and she was here, and that was the complete inventory of the situation. She opened it, page folded once. His handwriting, smaller than on the envelope, the pen pressed with intention. If you found this room, Stephanie, then you did what I was afraid you might not do. You came. That's more than I had the courage to do for too long. What's in this room is yours. All of it. Not because I'm trying to explain myself, but because you deserve to know what actually happened. Start with the blue notebook on the second shelf, the one labeled Year 1. She looked at the shelves, second shelf from the top, near the center of the left wall. A composition notebook with a blue cover, labeled in black marker. She reached up and took it down. She opened it to the first page. Raymond Harris had dated the first entry, November 17, 1999. 5 days after Stephanie's 4th birthday. His handwriting here was different from the envelope, from the pantry labels, looser, writing of a man moving fast because he needed the pressure of pen on paper and was not thinking yet about who might read it. The first line. Called the county office again this morning. 3rd time this week. Told me the placement file is confidential pending evaluation and I need to be patient. Patient. My daughter has been in state care for 6 months and I need to be patient, she read. Above her, the farmhouse was quiet. The fire in the wood stove had gone cold. The sealed envelope from the attorney's office sat on the kitchen table in the dark, and in a room beneath the floor of her father's kitchen, Stephanie Ann Harris was reading the first words of a story she had been living inside for 21 years, without knowing it had a different ending than the one she had been given. She turned the page. Her notebook ran to 81 pages. She read all of them before she came back upstairs. By the time she climbed the 6 stone steps and lowered the flooring section behind her, the kitchen windows had gone from black to the specific gray that arrives about 40 minutes before dawn, that tentative light that has not committed yet. Her back ached from the wooden chair. The coffee she had made the evening before was cold on the table. She filled the kettle and put it on the gas burner. She stood at the window and looked at the south field going gray through the glass. Notebook was a record of 14 months. November 1999 to January 2001. Every phone call Raymond Harris made to the Calhoun County Department of Human Resources, logged by date and time, and the name of whoever answered and what they said. Every letter he sent with a note about when he sent it and whether he received a response. Every appointment with attorneys, 2 in the first year, a 3rd starting in month 8 when the second one told him the petition process was going to take longer than either had anticipated. 14 months of documentation. And at the end of year 1, what Raymond had, a petition that had been accepted, assigned a reference number, and then transferred to senior review by a supervisor named Colleen Grant, after which it had gone quiet in a way that petitions did not normally go quiet. The kettle boiled. Made instant coffee from a jar in the pantry. She drank it at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the mug. A4. She thought about the woman who had come to the door of the Hazel Street Group home 12 years ago when George White drove up with Raymond's birthday package. A woman who had known the specific language, legal restriction on unsolicited communications, with the fluency of someone who had prepared for the possibility of that conversation. She thought about Margaret pressing her hands together under the conference table. She thought about Ryan in the parking structure with $11,000 memorized. None of these were proof. They were pattern. I'd spent a decade at the parish records office, learning what patterns in documentation meant about events no longer directly observable. It was a useful training. She finished her coffee. She went back downstairs. She spent the second day in the room, working through the composition notebooks in order, pulling each one from the shelf, reading it at the desk, replacing it. Handwriting changed across the years, urgent and compressed in the early notebooks, slower and more deliberate in the middle ones, then slower again toward the end, in a way that was not resignation but something more like a man who had stopped fighting the clock and instead to be thorough. Year 2 began where Year 1 ended, with Coqueline Grant. Raymond had spent 6 months in Year 2 trying to find out why his petition had stopped moving, called the DCFS office repeatedly, was told it was under senior review, wrote a letter to the director's office, received a form response. Ikes hired a third attorney, Paula Creech, in Anniston, who spent 2 months trying to get a status update through official channels and received the same form response. Paula Creech made a call through informal channels, a colleague in the family court clerk's office who owed her a favor and could look at filing records without it being a formal request. Raymond had written what Paula told him in Year 2's notebook, in a handwriting slightly less controlled than the entries before it. The letters wider, the pressure on the pen heavier. Colin Grant is Margaret Robinson's first cousin. They found this in a Calhoun County records search. They share a maiden name on the maternal side. Grant retired in 2005. Before she retired, she personally held Raymond's petition for 14 months without processing it. No formal denial, no approval, just held. By the time Grant retired and the petition passed to her replacement, Stephanie had been moved 3 times. A new family court judge reviewed the situation and noted that further disruption was not in the child's interest. Raymond had written below that she wasn't disrupted, she was put somewhere and left there. The disruption happened 4 years ago when I wasn't able to get to her. Nobody counted that. Stephanie set the notebook down on the desk. The cold in the room had settled into the back of her shoulders. She had not noticed it while reading. She came upstairs at noon and ate something, and stood on the porch for 10 minutes in the November air, cold enough to see her breath. A Southfield was doing its late season thing. Brown standing grass moving in a wind she could barely feel at face level, she thought. A first cousin with a filing position in the county DCFS office was not a conspiracy. A family connection used precisely and quietly enough that it would look like bureaucratic delay to anyone who was not holding all 14 months of Raymond Harris's phone call logs side by side. Raymond had been holding all 14 months of his phone call logs side by side. He had been holding them for 20 years. She went back inside. She went back downstairs. She kept reading. There, too, she also found the first reference to what Paula Creech had told Raymond about the custody paperwork filed at the time of Sandra Harris's death. The original forms, processed in the chaos of a county system stretched beyond capacity, asked a question about parental rights as pending rather than established. A clerical designation that should have been corrected within days and had instead been allowed to stand. Margaret's attorney had found that designation in the first month after Sandra died and had used it to generate enough procedural ambiguity that Raymond's path to Stephanie was routed through the petition system rather than directly through family court. Legal, it was not illegal. It was the kind of move that a careful person with the right connection at the right moment could make in a system that was underfunded and overloaded and staffed by people who were trying to do their jobs without enough hours in the day to do them correctly. Raymond had written, Margaret, a careful person. I did not understand this soon enough. Stephanie held the notebook and looked at that sentence for a long time. It was the most efficient summary of a 20-year failure she had ever read. I too back on the shelf. She pulled year 3. She kept reading until the room's single bulb was the only light, and the notebook in her hands was year 4, and the stone walls were dark around her, and she was nowhere close to done. Exibs Part 2. Year 4, Raymond had written about driving to Gadsden. Not to the group home specifically. He did not know which one Stephanie was in at that point. I had driven to Gadsden because it was the county seat of Etowah County, and the DCFS office there had jurisdiction over her latest placement, according to court documents he had eventually received after Paula Creech filed a formal discovery request. He sat in the parking lot of the DCFS office for 45 minutes, did not go in, drove back to Calhoun County, wrote about it without apology and without self-pity, which was more difficult to read than either of those things would have been. I don't know what I would have said if I'd gone in. I had the documents. I had the reference number. I had Paula's notes. What I did not have was the conviction that walking in there would move anything forward instead of sideways. So I sat. Then I left. I am not proud of the pattern this is becoming. The pattern this is becoming. Read it twice. The sentence had the quality of a man naming something about himself he would have preferred not to name. A man who was precise enough to understand his own failures, but not yet willing to stop making them. At year 5 recorded the second attorney change. Paula Creech had done what she could through official channels and told Raymond, in a meeting he documented in careful detail, a petition was not dead, but was in a procedural state that could persist for another 2 to 3 years before any family court would be compelled to act on it. She told him his options. He could file for expedited review, required demonstrating imminent harm to the child. A standard he could not meet because Stephanie was not in imminent harm. She was in a stable placement. H was the system's definition of success, regardless of whether the father who should have had access to her was sitting in parking lots in Gadsden, unable to go inside. Or he could wait. Or he could find a different attorney who had different relationships with the Etowah County Family Court clerks. He chose option 3. Year 6 was the year Raymond drove to the elementary school where Stephanie was enrolled in Gadsden. I had the address from the PI he hired that year, a man named Calvin Ware who worked out of a Talladega office and was straightforward about what he could and could not find. Calvin had found the school. Raymond drove there on a Tuesday morning and parked down the block from the entrance. The school day was starting. Children were going in through the main doors. He could not identify Stephanie among them. He wrote, "I don't know what she looks like now. I have the hospital photograph from when she was born. She will have changed in ways I cannot calculate from a photograph taken 6 years ago." I sat until the doors closed and the yard was empty. Then I drove home. Reading this, Stephanie felt something that was not pity and not anger and not forgiveness. It was the specific feeling of understanding a person's failure at the exact level at which it occurred. Not excusing it, not condemning it, just seeing it clearly at the size it actually was. Raymond Harris had not been a man incapable of love. He had been a man incapable, at specific moments, of the action that love required. I had known it while it was happening, and he had written it down, because the writing was the only form of accountability he had available. She set year 6 on the desk, and did not pick up year 7 right away. She sat in the cold stone room under the pull-cord bulb and thought about all the versions of a person you can be at the same time. The one who tries, and the one who fails, and the one who documents the failure, as if documentation might eventually amount to something, and how those versions could all be the same person, and how you were supposed to feel about that person depended on whether you were reading it from the inside or from the outside, and she was reading it from both. She picked up year 7, found the walnut box in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet on the afternoon of the second day in the room. The drawer was locked. The key was in its tin on the 3rd shelf, labeled personal. Raymond had apparently decided was sufficient deterrent or sufficient instruction, depending on who was looking. The box was walnut, clearly handmade, paints clean and the surface sanded smooth in the way of something that had taken time and had been meant to take time. Her name was carved into the lid, Stephanie Ann Harris, in letters cut carefully, the depth even, the spacing considered. Oh, the name, a date, November 12, 1999, her 4th birthday, the year after Sandra Harris died. He had made the box the year she turned 4. He had been filling it ever since. Inside, 21 envelopes arranged in order, baked with a length of red baling twine, cut to exactly the right length and tied in a bow that suggested someone who had practiced the motion. Each envelope was dated on the outside. November 12 of every year from 1999 to 2019. Later, for every year Stephanie had been alive, none of them had been sent. She sat on the stone floor with the box in her lap. The filing cabinet drawer was open beside her. The room was very cold and very quiet. 21 years. Aiding farm. A man writing to his daughter every November 12th and keeping the letter because he did not know whether sending it would help or make things worse, and erring on the side of keeping it because at minimum the letter was something he could not lose. Like the phone calls that went unanswered. Unlike the petition that went quiet. Unlike the package that George White had driven back from Hazel Street. The letters were the one thing Raymond Harris had made that could not be returned to him. Because he never sent them. She did not open them right away. She sat with them. She was aware that this was a feeling she did not have a practiced response to, but the practiced responses she did have, the ones developed in group homes and records offices and parking structures, where she held herself in a very specific stillness, were not useful here. Some things are too large for the room you are trying to put them in. You just have to let them sit beside you for a while until the room expands. She read the letters in order starting with 1999. The first was 3 sentences. I'd written it in the voice of a man who did not yet know how to write to a 4-year-old he could not reach, who understood the form of the thing was slightly absurd and wrote it anyway because the alternative was not writing it. Dear Stephanie, 4 years old. I am thinking about you and I am going to find a way to tell you so someday. The letters from her early years were accumulations of small, specific things. I described the farm in November, the soybean fields going brown, the way the pecan trees looked when the hulls dropped, the quality of November light in Calhoun County, which was different. He wrote, from any other month's light, out and more honest. He wrote about Sandra, not about her death. About her, he described the way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. Ever of her coat. A dark red wool coat she had worn for 4 winters, because she refused to replace something that was still working. They had driven to Lake Chinnaby in January, on a dare from Sandra's sister, and the car had slid on black ice, and they had sat in the ditch for 20 minutes laughing too hard to call for help. These were things Stephanie did not know. Mother had died when she was 4. What she knew of Sandra Harris was 2 photographs she had requested copies of from the county records when she aged out of the system at 18. A small biographical entry in a DHR document, the name Sandra, written on the inside of a paperback book she'd found at a group home book exchange when she was 7, and kept because the name was her mother's name. Letters from her early years were the first time anyone had described Sandra Harris to her as a person rather than as a category on a document. She sat on the stone floor and read them and understood, for the first time, had not only been separated from her father. She had been separated from her mother's story, which should have come to her through him, and had not, because he had not been able to get to her. The loss inside the loss, pain that had no category on any document. The letters from her teenage years changed in tone. Quieter, more careful, the sentences held tighter. By that point, Raymond had accepted that the letters were not going anywhere. Less writing them because the habit of writing them was the only continuous act of fatherhood available to him, and he was going to perform it with as much integrity as the constraint allowed. He wrote about the farm in those years, about a drought in year 10 that cost him the Eastfield yield entirely, about a steer that broke through the north fence 3 times in 1 month, and the philosophical dimensions of that experience. Liked extension registration he had started, and what he was thinking when he set it up. He wrote, I don't know if this farm will go to you, I don't know if you'll want it, but if it does, and if you do, I want you to know that it has always been a place where the door could stay open, not because it was required, because it was possible, That seemed like a reason. Read the letter from the year she turned 22. The year Raymond had hired the private investigator who found her working at the gas station in Bessemer. He wrote about driving there, about sitting in the diner across the street for 2 hours. About watching her through the window, he wrote, "She has her mother's laugh. The same pause before it, like the laugh is coming from somewhere deeper than the joke. It went back to Calhoun County without going in." He wrote at the end of that letter, "That was a coward's decision, and I am going to have to live with it. But I was afraid that if she looked at me and did not know me, or knew me and turned away, I would not survive it intact, and the farm is the thing I need to keep intact for her. So I chose the farm over the moment, and I don't know if that is right or wrong. I just know it is what I did." Folded the letter along its original creases. Put it back in its envelope. Put the envelope back in the box in order. There was no adequate response to a man who loved someone badly and knew it, and kept the evidence anyway. Forgiveness. Forgiveness implied a verdict, and she had not arrived at a verdict. Not anger. Anger would have required a simpler story than the one in the composition notebooks and the walnut box. What she had, sitting on that stone floor, it was something more like the sensation of a window being opened in a room that had been sealed for a long time. Not warmth yet, just the change in air. Drove to Talladega the following afternoon. Donna Jackson's address had been in Year Two's notebook. Raymond had tracked her down 8 years ago. After reading about her retirement in a Talladega County newsletter his third attorney had passed along. He had written her name and address in the margin of the notebook and circled it. The closest Raymond Harris came to underlining something. She kept notes. She said she'd talk to Stephanie if Stephanie ever came looking. Donna had written the letter Stephanie found in the filing cabinet's top drawer on the second day. 4 years ago, addressed to Raymond directly. "Raymond, I kept my field notes from 1999. I shouldn't have, but I did. If Stephanie ever wants to know what really happened with the transfer, I have it. You know where to find me. I'm retired now. I'm not afraid of anything anymore." Arrived to Talladega, took 38 minutes on routes that flattened out. As they went south, the Talladega foothills receding in the rear view. Jackson's address was a brick ranch house on a residential street, with mature oaks on both sides, leaves down now, the branches making their winter geometry against the gray Alabama sky. I opened the door before Stephanie had finished knocking, which meant she had heard the car. She had a pot of coffee already on, which meant she had been waiting for this visit in some form for longer than just today. The inside of the house was ordered. Not sparse, books and photographs and the accumulated objects of a life, but organized in the way a person organizes space when they have spent a career in environments where disorder had consequences. Dr. Jackson was 62 years old and built like a woman who had spent 30 years doing difficult work in under-resourced conditions and had not retired from the posture that work required. She brought the coffee to the table. The folder. The folder was manila thick, the edges soft with age. She had kept it in a filing cabinet of her own. She said this without embarrassment, as a fact requiring no apology, because she had looked at the Raymond Harris petition in 1999 and understood that something was wrong with it, and she had not found a way to be wrong about that in 22 years of looking back. Notes were typed on a manual typewriter, dated and initialed at the top of each page. The first entry was dated October 12, 1999, the week after Raymond Harris filed his initial petition. A had been the field supervisor assigned to intake review. Her notes documented what she had received, what she had done with it, and what happened next, which was, she sent it to senior review per standard protocol. Standard protocol meant it went to the senior field supervisor on the case. In 1999, the senior field supervisor for petitions in the relevant jurisdiction was Colleen Grant. Donna's second entry, dated 3 weeks later, noted she had followed up with Grant about the status and received no response. Her third entry, 1 month after that, noted she had sent a written memo to Grant and received a form acknowledgement but no substantive update. Her fourth entry was dated March 2000. Spoke to supervisor about Harris petition, told it was being handled at the senior level and I should focus on active caseload. Recorded for my own files. There was a fifth entry, written in pen in different handwriting than the typed notes, older, slightly less controlled. This is a personal addendum, not an official record. After I retired, I looked up the relationship between Colleen Grant and Margaret Robinson, and second wife of Raymond Harris, first cousins on the maternal side. I should have found this when the petition was filed. I don't know that finding it would have changed anything, given who I would have had to report it to. I should have looked. That's my part of this. So Stephanie read the addendum twice. Then she looked up at Donna, eyes watching her with the steady attention of a person who had been waiting for a specific reaction and was prepared for any of them. Stephanie said, "This is real." Donna said, "All of it." Then Donna said something else. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't push harder in 1999. I was 39 years old and I had a caseload of 62 active files and a supervisor who made it clear that stepping outside your lane had career consequences. That's an explanation, not an excuse. I know the difference." There was nothing to say to that which would have been adequate, so Stephanie said nothing. She asked if she could take the folder. Donna said she could take a copy. She had made one already, anticipating this, and that she would sign and notarize the original if it was ever needed for legal purposes. Stephanie drove back to Delwood on the same routes in reverse, the Talladega foothills rising ahead of her, Donna's folder on the passenger seat. She pulled off at a rest area north of town, sat with the engine running, and looked at the folder. 22 years of her life had been organized around a specific understanding of what had happened when Sandra Harris died. That Raymond had not come, that the absence was a choice, belonged to the category of people whose fathers made that choice. She had not spent 22 years being actively angry about it. She burned through anger too fast. What remained was more like a settled awareness of her own categories. But the story she had been living inside had shaped the specific way she understood herself, what she was owed, what she could expect, but she did not waste time hoping for. That story was not accurate. It was not entirely false. Raymond had made bad decisions, driven to Bessemer and sat in a diner for 2 hours and driven back. That fear cost them both time they could not recover. His failures were real, and she would think about them for a long time. But the architecture of the absence had been built by someone else. The folder on the passenger's seat was the architectural drawings. She found the county extension agreement on the 4th day, in the wooden crates on the lower shelves. She had been working through the crates systematically. You work through anything. When systematic was the only approach that got you to the end without missing something. The crates held the operational history of the Harris farm across 3 generations. Purchase receipts, equipment logs, labor contracts, soybean yield records going back 20 years. The farm's functional life documented with the same careful habit Raymond brought to everything. In one crate near the bottom, a manila folder labeled County Extension Agreement, Emergency Housing Protocol, a signed document, 11 years old, between Raymond Harris and the Calhoun County Cooperative Extension Service. A document registered the Harris farmhouse as an approved temporary resource dwelling, available to county extension field workers to place individuals or families facing acute housing emergencies. Renewable annually at no cost, with a small maintenance stipend from the county to cover utilities for any occupants placed through the program. Raymond had renewed it every year for 11 years. The last renewal signature was dated the February before he died. The current year's renewal had not been completed because Raymond had died in July and nobody had continued it. A note in his handwriting was clipped to the back of the folder on a plain piece of paper. I renewed this every year, because the county sent anyone often. Some years nobody came at all, but keeping it on the books meant the option existed. The option existing meant someone who needed a door could find one. That seemed like enough reason to sign a piece of paper once a year. Stephanie sat with the document for a while. She thought about Raymond driving to Delwood the first Saturday of every month for 30 years. Thought about him sitting under the pecan tree looking at the south field. She thought about the resource log she would find in a later crate. 8 pages, handwritten, organized by category. Housing, legal aid, food assistance, medical resources for the uninsured, county programs for aging adults, employment resources for people exiting the corrections system. He had compiled it over several years, updating it when things changed, noting in the margin when a number had been disconnected or a program had ended. He had kept a list of where to send people who needed somewhere to go. He had never told anyone about it. I just kept it current and kept it in the crate and renewed the extension agreement every February and waited to see who came. She understood something now that she had not understood when she arrived. Her father had not been a man of large gestures. He had been a man of maintained commitments, the composition notebooks, the birthday letters, the extension registration, the resource log, small annual acts performed over a long time without an audience. The farm was not the inheritance, the habit was. And she was sitting in a room 12 feet underground holding the evidence of it. The question of whether she was going to continue it or not was already becoming less like a question and more like a thing she had already decided without yet saying so out loud. The extension folder on the desk beside the composition notebooks. She went back to the crates. She kept working. On the afternoon of the fourth day, while she was organizing the last crate's contents, she heard a truck on the gravel lane. She came up from the room and looked out the kitchen window, a pickup she did not recognize, parking at the gate. The driver got out and walked up the drive with his hands in the pockets of a canvas work jacket. The specific walk of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was not confident about any of it. Harry Young stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the farmhouse for a moment with the expression people wear when a building carries complicated associations they have not finished sorting. Then he looked at her. But he was not there for Ryan. Ryan did not know he had come. She waited. He said he had a question. He asked, "Did she find anything in the house?" She said, "Like what?" A long pause. Gary looked at the south field doing its November stillness, looked back at her. He said, when he was 19, he had been in his father's truck. He had seen a letter in the door pocket, just the corner of an envelope with Stephanie's name on the front. He didn't take it, mentioned it to Margaret that evening. Margaret had taken the truck the next morning. When Gary asked about the letter a few days later, Margaret said it was handled. He said, "I didn't ask what that meant. I was 19 and it was easier not to ask." He paused. "I should have asked." There was a version of this moment that was simple. A person admitting a failure, another person deciding what to do with it. Like the failure Gary was describing had a specific cost that was not abstract to Stephanie. She had been living in a group home when Gary Young was 19 and deciding it was easier not to ask. She did not say this. Started while looking at him standing at the bottom of her porch steps in November in his canvas jacket, with his hands in his pockets. Then she asked, "How many letters do you think there were?" Gary said he didn't know. He had never looked. 21. One for every year. He absorbed that without looking away, which took something she gave him credit for it. She told him what she had found in the room beneath the kitchen. But everything, not the composition notebooks in detail, not Donna Jackson's folder, but the letters, the walnut box, documentation of 14 months of phone calls, and a custody petition that had sat in Colleen Grant's hands for 14 months without moving. She told him enough that the shape of it was visible. He sat down on the porch step. After a while he said, "I didn't know it went that far back." She said, "Your mother did." He didn't deny it. He sat on the step and looked at the south field and didn't deny it. That whatever Gary Young had been carrying for 20 years, it was not the comfort of genuine ignorance. Eventually he stood. He said, "I'm glad you came. It's more than I expected to be able to say." Walked back down the drive and got in his truck and turned south toward Anniston. Stephanie stood on the porch after he left, oafed about the category of people who watch wrong things happen and choose the comfort of not knowing over the discomfort of asking. It was a large category. She had lived inside the consequences of it for 21 years. Gary Young was not its worst example. That was not the same as it being all right. Margaret Robinson Harris left a voicemail on a Tuesday morning while Stephanie was in the room reading Year 7. She listened to it standing under the pull-cord bulb with the cold in her shoulders. Margaret's voice was even, controlled, carrying the specific warmth of someone who had decided in advance That warmth was the strategically correct register. She said she thought they should talk. She said she was concerned about the property situation and wanted to make sure Stephanie had the right information. She said she was available for coffee, wherever was convenient. Wherever was convenient. Stephanie called back and agreed to a diner in Anniston. Margaret's suggestion. 2 days later, Margaret arrived first. She was at a corner table when Stephanie walked in, hot tea in hand, a posture the deliberate geometry of a woman who had organized this meeting and was not going to let it go sideways through carelessness. She looked at Stephanie with an expression calibrated to concern, not theatrical, like the ambient warmth of someone who had decided to frame this as a conversation between two women who both cared about a complicated situation. She said she understood this was a hard time. She said Raymond had been unwell in his final years, physically or not only, and that some of his personal documents might reflect a man rewriting his own history to make himself feel better about choices he had not been willing to examine honestly when he made them. She said this gently, an accusation, as if offering Stephanie a tool for context. Then she said she knew Ryan had mentioned the property situation. She said she had a different contact, a developer, not a land management company, someone who had handled sensitive property transactions in Calhoun County before and understood the family dimensions. A better offer, possibly. Something Stephanie could consider without feeling pushed. She said, "I'm trying to help." Let her finish. Let the sentence land and stay. Then she opened her bag and took out Donna Jackson's folder, not the copy, the original, which Donna had signed and notarized the day before at Stephanie's request. They set it on the table. She opened it to the page with Colleen Grant's name. She did not explain it. She let Margaret see the name. Margaret looked at the folder. Something happened in her face. Not dramatic, not collapsing. Very small adjustment around the eyes. The kind a face makes when it encounters something it was not prepared for and has to rapidly decide how to handle. She said she didn't know what this was supposed to prove. Stephanie said, "Colleen Grant held my father's custody petition for 14 months without processing it. That's in a field supervisor's personal notes from 1999, signed and notarized." George White drove to the Hazel Street group home in 2008 with a birthday package from my father. And a woman answered the door and told him contact was legally restricted. George remembers that woman clearly. 73 years old, and his memory works. Margaret's hands were on the table, very still. Stephanie said, "I'm not here to take you to court. I have enough to make things complicated for you if I wanted to, and I don't want to. I'm here because I needed you to know that I know what happened. And I needed to say that to your face." Margaret Robinson Harris looked at Stephanie across the diner table. She did not admit anything, placed her teacup down in its saucer, with the careful placement of a person controlling a small physical action because the larger ones were not available. She stood. She put on her coat, button by button, deliberate. And she picked up her bag and she looked at Stephanie once more. Then she walked out of the diner. No scene. No denial either. Just a woman putting on her coat and leaving while the tea cooled in the cup. Stephanie sat at the table until she finished her coffee. The folder was still open in front of her, Colleen Grant's name on the page, Donna Jackson's initials at the top. She closed it. She paid for both cups of tea and the coffee, left a reasonable tip. She walked out into the Anniston afternoon. There was no clean feeling on the other side of that. She had expected something, not triumph. She was not built for triumph, but some sense of the account being settled. What she had instead was the specific fatigue of doing something you needed to do that was also exhausting and did not produce a tidy result. Margaret had not confessed. Margaret had not crumbled, but Margaret had left without saying it was not true. Some silences are a position. They just do not come with a certificate. The county extension office called on a Thursday afternoon, while Stephanie was on the porch with the property survey trying to understand the drainage situation in the southwest corner of the south field. A man named Marcus identified himself as a field coordinator for the Calhoun County Cooperative Extension Service. He said he had a young man in his caseload, aged out of a Gadsden group home 6 weeks prior, not able to secure stable housing, currently in a short-term motel situation that was running out. He said the Harris farm was on their registered resources list. He was calling to verify whether the resource was still active under the new owner before he sent anyone over. Looked at the south field. She said, "Yes, send him." The county van arrived the following afternoon. The young man who got out had a duffel bag and a skateboard and a face arranged into an expression working very hard at not caring how this went. His name was Kevin Perez. He was 20. Last name was Perez because the family who had taken him in at 14 and eventually adopted him were named Perez. He was white, sandy-haired, angular, in the way of someone who had grown up without quite enough of everything and had compensated with a jaw set forward and shoulders that said, "Keep going without stopping to check whether you were welcome." The mirror of Stephanie's story she might have expected. He was angrier, more surface damaged. Where she had developed precision, he had developed noise. Not the loud kind, but the internal kind, the kind that made him answer questions one word at a time and look at the middle distance when he was not sure of the current situation. She showed him the upstairs room. She explained the extension agreement clearly, the whole structure of it. He was formally registered with the county as a temporary housing placement. She was the resource dwelling owner. There was a small county stipend covering utility costs, no hidden conditions, no informal arrangements that could change without warning. She said there was work on the property if he wanted it, and he was welcome to eat in the kitchen. He looked around. The room, the iron frame bed, the window overlooking the east field, radiator doing its knocking thing in the corner. Then, "What's the catch?" She said there was not one, but she understood why he was asking. Looked at her for a moment, the specific look of assume recalibrating whether their initial read was correct, not trusting yet, but recalculating. She said dinner was at 6. She left him to it. Was in the south field with the drainage survey when she heard him on the roof. Not announced, not asked, but gone up to look at the east wing section. She had mentioned in passing that morning and was moving along the pitch, checking. The flashing with the methodical attention of someone who had decided to treat the physical problem as more interesting than the situation around it. Watched him for a moment from the field. Then she went back to the survey. 2 people could work on a property without it needing to be discussed. Ryan Robinson Harris filed his legal petition in Calhoun County Circuit Court on November 28th. A document arrived certified mail the following Wednesday. Stephanie read it at the kitchen table while Kevin was outside with a crowbar removing the broken porch railing section. The petition's argument was narrow. Laws in Alabama property law governing bequests to heirs not formally acknowledged during the testator's lifetime. The argument was that Raymond Harris, having no official parental record on file with any state or county agency in Alabama, designate Stephanie Harris as a recognized heir under the specific bequest language in his will. Ryan's attorney had found the argument. It was real. It was also the kind of legal theory that worked in situations where the paper trail was thin and the timeline pressure was tight. And Ryan's timeline pressure was built into the petition. The Calhoun County property tax deadline was January 31st. If a legal challenge created uncertainty about ownership, the most rational thing for Stephanie to do was accept Ryan's offer before the lien clock ran out. The design of it was clean. She had to give him that. She drove to Noble Street in Anniston the following day and found the offices of Sharon Ramirez, a property and estate attorney whose practice had the specific absence of decorative ambition that characterized offices where billing was justified by results. Sharon was in her 50s, unhurried, reading glasses of someone who had read a great many documents under a great many kinds of pressure and had not been made faster or slower by any of them. Sharon read the petition, set it on the desk, asked 2 questions. Was there any document in Raymond Harris's records formally acknowledging his paternity of Stephanie Harris? And was there any documented evidence of attempts by Raymond Harris to establish a legal relationship with Stephanie during her minority? Hayes told her. There was a room full of it, below the kitchen floor. Sharon went quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone recalibrating the parameters of a problem, and asked, "Can I come see the room?" But they drove to the farm together the following morning. Sharon spent 2 hours in the room beneath the kitchen. Photographed the composition notebooks and the walnut box, and the letters, and the 1999 family court petition, with its Calhoun County filing reference number. She photographed Donna Jackson's notarized field notes, came back upstairs, and sat at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and said, "Ryan's petition argued that Raymond Harris never formally acknowledged you as his heir. Raymond Harris left in that room his 31 composition notebooks of dated, documented attempts to establish exactly that legal relationship, including a signed petition with a reference number, including attorney engagement letters, including the 2007 visitation rights order. The argument that Raymond Harris failed to acknowledge his daughter as a legal heir is going to run directly into a room full of evidence that he spent the better part of 20 years trying to do exactly that, and was systematically prevented from doing so." First, and added, "We file a counter-response." Stephanie said, "We file a counter-response." Kevin was on the roof when they came back outside, pressing the edge of a section of new flashing down firmly with his palm. Looked down from the roofline with the expression of someone who had decided to treat the roof situation as more interesting than whatever the adults were discussing below. Which was, Stephanie thought, exactly the right response. Both still needed finishing. The weather window was finite. Ryan Robinson Harris had left a farm with a leaking roof and a tax problem and a carefully constructed legal argument. What he had not known about, what none of them had known about, was the room part 3. Sharon Ramirez filed the counter-response on December 14th. Stephanie drove to Anniston to sign the documents in person because she had learned, working a decade in the parish records office, that anything worth doing in the official record was worth doing with your signature on the physical paper. Sharon had the folder ready on her desk. The counter-response ran to 41 pages with exhibits, a photograph of the 1999 family court petition with its Calhoun County filing number, a photograph of year 1's first entry, dated and in Raymond's handwriting, naming Stephanie Ann Harris explicitly as his daughter and the reason for the petition, the 2007 visitation rights order, Donna Jackson's notarized field notes, a signed affidavit from George White describing the November afternoon he had driven to Hazel Street with a birthday package and been turned away by a woman who told him contact was legally restricted. Lane set it on the desk and slid it towards Stephanie without fanfare, the way she did everything, action first, explanation available on request. Stephanie signed where the tabs indicated. She put the pen down, looked at 41 pages of what Raymond Harris had spent 20 years building in a room below a kitchen floor, now organized into legal exhibit format, with numbered tabs and a table of contents. I'd been waiting for someone to know how to use it. He just did not live long enough to hand it to them directly. She drove back to the farm in the dark. Ryan's attorney requested a continuance on December 22nd. Granted, Evan was rescheduled from January 9th to January 19th, 11 days before the property tax deadline. The timing was not subtle. A continuance pushed the hearing closer to the lien date. It put Stephanie in the position of waiting for a legal outcome that might not arrive before January 31st, which meant she would be carrying both the legal uncertainty and the financial deadline simultaneously, a combination designed to produce a specific kind of pressure that made selling feel like relief rather than defeat. Ryan's attorney requested a second continuance on January 7th. Sharon called Stephanie at 7 in the morning with the news. Taste had the even quality it always carried, which meant either she was never surprised by anything, or she had decided long ago that surprise was not a professionally useful response. She told Stephanie the second continuance had been filed, and that she had opposed it, and that the judge had granted it anyway because the grounds were technically sufficient. Stephanie was standing at the kitchen window when she took the call. Kevin was already outside. She could hear him in the barn, the sound of the barn doors, and then something being moved across the concrete floor, vertical and early in the way that he did things when he was working out something he was not going to talk about. She said, "So the hearing is when?" Sharon said, "January 16th, 15 days before the tax deadline." Stephanie said, "Okay." Aish put the phone down on the counter. She stood at the window for a while. The south field was doing its January thing, the grass low and brown, soil hard with the cold that had arrived properly after Christmas and was not going anywhere quickly. The pecan tree had been bare for 2 months. It looked like it knew something about patience that she was still working on. Went into the room beneath the kitchen and pulled Year 12 from the shelf. She read for 2 hours, not looking for anything specific, like just needing the weight of Raymond's handwriting, the evidence that a person could hold something carefully for a very long time and not be diminished by the holding. The property tax bill required $11,340 by January 31st. Stephanie had $9,200 in savings, dated over 7 years of working at the parish records office and living the specific small life of someone who saved against the knowledge that things could become suddenly expensive. Paid a car loan she had been paying down for 3 years. She had a Baton Rouge apartment lease still technically running, the rent being paid from her checking account on automatic draft for a unit she had not slept in since late October. Likely, she sat at the kitchen table and worked through the arithmetic on a piece of paper the way her 3rd grade teacher at the Gadsden Elementary Annex had taught her. All the numbers visible, nothing carried in her head, because her head was not trustworthy for arithmetic when she was also doing other things in it. She was $2,140 short. They called her bank and took a short-term personal loan against the car, $3,000, which covered the shortfall and left a small buffer. The interest rate was not catastrophic. Monthly payments were manageable alongside her remote work income from the parish records office, which she had renegotiated to part-time remote 4 weeks into her time at the farm, despite her supervisor agreeing, because Stephanie had been doing her job well enough for long enough that her supervisor had a practical interest in keeping her. She called the Calhoun County Revenue Commissioner's office and told them she was the heir to the Raymond Harris property and she was intending to pay the back taxes in full before the deadline. The woman on the phone told her the amount and the payment options and the deadline and thanked her for calling. It was a professional transaction. Stephanie appreciated that it was not complicated by anything else. Hired the full amount on January 22nd, 9 days before the deadline. The lien notice that had been sitting in the kitchen drawer since she arrived moved from the drawer to the folder in the room below. There she kept documents that were no longer active problems. Ian's legal challenge was withdrawn on January 15th. Stephanie learned about it from Sharon, who called on a Tuesday afternoon while Stephanie and Kevin were on the farmhouse roof. Kevin had identified the east wing flashing problem in November, and they had gotten a partial patch on it in December, but the real repair required removing a section of old flashing and replacing it properly, required a day with no rain in the forecast and 2 people willing to be on a roof in January in Alabama. The day had arrived. They were up there with roofing cement and new flashing, and a cold wind from the northwest doing its best to complicate the situation when Sharon called. Stephanie sat back on her heels against the pitch of the roof and looked at her phone. Avon said, "No ground stated. The challenge is vacated." Stephanie said, "Okay." Sharon said, "You own the farm, uncontested." She said, "I know, thank you." She put the phone in her jacket pocket, looked out from the roof line at the view she had been too busy to properly take in from up here. The full spread of the Harris property visible from this angle, the south field running long, the barn and the outbuildings, a gravel lane going down through the pecan trees toward the county road, the Talladega foothills going blue in the distance behind a layer of January haze. Kevin was looking at her from 3 feet away on the same pitch of roof, like cement on his forearms, the expression of someone who had decided to treat the current moment as information rather than conclusion. She said, "It's over." He said, "Yeah?" She said, "Yeah." He considered this for approximately 2 seconds, and he turned back to the flashing and pressed the edge down firmly with his palm, making the seal. Because the roof still needed finishing, and the weather window was finite and Kevin Perez. Whatever else he was, but a person who stopped doing the work because the context of the work had changed. She turned back to her section and kept going. They finished the roof repair by 3 in the afternoon. Kevin went to clean up. Stephanie stood in the south field in her work coat and looked at the farmhouse from the angle Raymond had seen every morning walking out to the barn. The east wing roofline straight now, the new flashing catching the winter light along its edge. The land management company Ryan had mentioned in the Aniston parking structure called her cell phone on a Wednesday 2 weeks after the withdrawal, and with a careful voice told her he understood she had recently become the owner of the Harris property, and he wanted to make sure she had all the options available to her as she considered next steps. He had comparable sales figures. They had a buyer who had expressed interest in the Calhoun County market. He was confident they could find a number that worked for everyone. She said the property was not for sale. He said he understood that and that if her situation changed, she should feel free to reach out. And he gave her his name and number with the professional warmth of someone who did not take this personally, because it was not personal. She put her phone back in her pocket and did not call. He did not write. The withdrawal had been filed by his attorney, and Ryan himself produced no communication, which was consistent with everything she knew about how Ryan Robinson Harris moved through the world. Forward, cleanly, toward the next thing, leaving the previous thing behind with the efficiency of a man for whom the previous thing had already been assessed and filed. She did not have feelings about his silence that she could have named precisely. Not relief, like disappointment. More like the specific neutrality of closing a drawer that had contained something active and finding it now contained something finished. In the third week of January, on a night when the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees, and the farm was making the sounds that old buildings made when the cold was serious. The tick and pop of contracting wood, battle of the northeast bedroom window she had not yet gotten to with weather stripping. Stephanie sat on the porch steps with her car keys in her hand. Not a metaphor, actual keys, in her actual hand. She'd been sitting there for 23 minutes, she knew, because she had checked her phone at the start, and then again, and the number was 23. The Baton Rouge apartment was still on the lease. Landlord had been patient because she had been a reliable tenant for 6 years and had explained her situation honestly, and he was a person who responded to honesty with reasonable flexibility. The lease came up for renewal in February, and she was going to have to make a decision. She could be back in Baton Rouge by Friday morning. Her desk at the parish records office would be there. A routine that had sustained her for 6 years would be there. The digitization work, the document trails, the precise satisfaction of making a record accurate. The small life she had assembled carefully from available pieces would still be there intact because she had been careful about how she assembled it. The reasons for going were all real. She was not manufacturing them. The problem was that the reasons she was listing in the dark on a porch in January in Alabama were the same reasons she had identified 4 weeks ago when she had still not unpacked her overnight bag. And she had unpacked the bag, repacked it with more things, actually, driven back to Baton Rouge for a long weekend in December to collect what she needed, and returned with 2 boxes and her winter coat and the framed photograph of Sandra Harris she kept on her kitchen counter. She was already living here. Had been living here for 2 months without calling it that. The car keys were in her hand because the weight of that recognition was significant. Not frightening, significant. The difference between a life you are visiting and a life you are living was a difference that required a moment to name, even if the only person in the naming was you. At 22 degrees, onto porch step, alone, she sat for 3 more minutes. Then she went back inside. Not because a feeling had arrived and settled the question. She was cold, and the wood stove needed another log, and Kevin had left the kitchen light on, and the square of yellow light in the kitchen window was the most pragmatic possible argument for going in rather than leaving. She went in. Put the keys on the kitchen counter. She added a log to the wood stove. She went to bed. She stayed. Marcus from the Calhoun County Cooperative Extension called in February. He had a woman in his caseload, Amy Walker, 41, 2 daughters, a protective order against her ex-husband granted in Etowah County 2 weeks earlier. Ex-husband knew her current address. He was not complying with the order's distance requirements. Amy needed to be somewhere outside Gadsden that was not on a list he could access easily. The registration was still active. Stephanie had contacted the extension office in mid-January and confirmed she was renewing the county emergency housing protocol agreement in her name. The renewal paperwork had taken 4 days. She had signed it and returned it by certified mail because she had learned from a decade of records work that the certified mail receipt was worth the $3 every time. Amy Walker arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 backpacks and a laundry bag and 2 girls, 8 and 10, doing the specific performance of being fine that children do when they have been through something adults do not have a clean language for. The older one got out of the car and looked at the farm with the flat assessment of a person who had given up, expecting things to be good, and was willing to accept that they might be okay. The younger one, whose name was Becca, looked at the pecan tree, and then at the barn, and then at Kevin, who was coming out of the barn with a length of copper pipe under his arm, and decided he was interesting. Stephanie gave them the 2 upstairs bedrooms. She moved her things to the downstairs bedroom that she had been avoiding because it had been Raymond's room, and she had not yet worked through what she thought about sleeping in the bed of a man she was in the process of knowing for the first time after his death. Worked through it now. It was a practical decision. The room had the best radiator in the house. She cleaned it, changed the bedding, moved in. Raymond would have understood the logic. He was a practical man. Amy Walker stood in the upstairs hallway on the first evening and said, "I don't know what this place is supposed to be." Stephanie said, "Me neither. But it has 3 bedrooms and the roof does not leak anymore." Amy looked at her. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. More the specific loosening that happened when a person who had been holding everything very tightly was given permission to let something go, even something small. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, all 5 of them. Kevin made rice and beans because it was the thing he could make in a large pot without having to think about it, which was what the situation called for. Baker asked Kevin if the skateboard in the corner of the mudroom was his. He said yes. She asked if he could teach her. He said the ground was frozen and the driveway was gravel, so probably not this week. Considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds brought to logistical problems and said, "But in the spring?" He said, "Sure." It was not a significant exchange, but Stephanie was watching it from across the table, and there was something in Kevin's willingness to say sure, without hesitation, without the guarded calculation that usually preceded his responses, just a yes to a small future thing that told her something she had not been sure of until that moment. He was starting to believe the conditions were not going to change. That was its own kind of progress, a kind that did not announce itself but showed up in the texture of small ordinary moments and stayed there. Amy Walker stayed 11 days. During that time, Stephanie connected her with a domestic violence housing advocate that Donna Jackson had put her in touch with, a woman in Talladega who had a network of rental resources in Etowah, Calhoun, and Cleburne counties, that's not on public listings and not requiring a prior address in the county as part of the application, which mattered when the prior address was the problem. Amy found a place in Oxford, Alabama. 2 bedrooms, a school district she had researched, a landlord who had worked with the housing advocate before and understood certain situations without requiring them to be explained. They paid the first month's security deposit with help from the Etowah County Domestic Violence Fund that Stephanie had found in the county services documentation. Raymond had kept in one of the wooden crates. He had listed it in his handwritten resource log dated 6 years ago, turned out to be still current and still funded. When Amy left, she hugged Stephanie at the door without ceremony. She had 2 girls in the car and a new address, and a landlord who knew not to give out her information as doing the next thing because the next thing was what you did. She had left a note on the kitchen table. Stephanie found it after the car was gone, a piece of notebook paper folded once, at which Amy had written in handwriting that was slightly uneven with the effort of keeping it steady. "I don't know what this place is supposed to be, but thank you for letting us be here while I figured out where to go." Stephanie put the note in the new composition notebook she had started on January 1st. Not a record of phone calls and petitions. A different kind of record. The note was the first thing in it. She wrote the date above it and nothing else. A second person Marcus sent was a man named Ronald Clark, 71. His farm in Cleburne County had gone to foreclosure after a medical debt spiral that started with a hip replacement that was supposed to be covered and was not. It continued through 2 years of collection actions and a credit situation that his adult children, themselves stretched thin, could not help him navigate out of. He had no family he could stay with. A truck and a sleeping bag he had owned for 20 years, and the knowledge that the extension office sometimes knew of places. Arrived on a Wednesday morning in February with the self-possession of an older man who was not going to allow the current circumstances to be the thing that defined him. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the barn. Old Stephanie he could work. She said she would not say no to that. He was in the barn within the hour. She did not ask what he was doing. Found out 2 days later when she walked in and found the north corner reorganized. Equipment sorted and hung. A workbench that had been sitting at a bad angle now squared to the wall. A section of old baling wire that had been a low-grade hazard wound properly and stored. She said, "You did not have to do all that." Ronald said, "I figured I'd be useful while I was here." He stayed 6 weeks, rakes the fence on the north pasture over the course of 4 days, without telling anyone he was going to do it, working at the pace of a man who knew how to do a thing right, and was not interested in doing it faster than that. Drove to Delwood twice to buy supplies at George White's store, and came back each time with exactly what he needed, and nothing extra. Left, moving to a subsidized senior housing unit in Anniston that Donna Jackson had helped him navigate, an apartment in a building that was clean and had a maintenance staff and a community room where things happened on a schedule. He shook Stephanie's hand at the door, not a hug, a handshake, firm and brief. Watched his truck go down the gravel lane. Then she went back inside and wrote his name and dates in the composition notebook. The notebook was filling in the way that things filled when you did not start with a plan for how full they would become. Entry by entry, each one specific, each one its own weight. Amy Walker's note, baked Clark's 6 weeks and the north fence line. But the small record of people who had come through the door, Raymond had kept on the books for 11 years, and that Stephanie had renewed in January with a 4-day turnaround and a certified mail receipt. It was not a program. It was not a shelter. A farm with an extension registration and a kitchen table and a resource log on the inside of a cabinet door, and it was doing what it had apparently always been able to do when the right person was in the farmhouse to open the door in the morning. Simple and unglamorous and real. George White nodded at her from behind the hardware counter every time she came into White's Hardware and feed through the spring and into the summer, and she came in regularly because the farm generated a steady need for hardware. Fencing supplies, roofing materials, a new section of gutter over the porch, various items in the barn that Kevin was working through with the methodical attention he applied to physical problems. She bought what she needed. He sold it to her. He sometimes said, "Sign." She told him. He nodded. This was their relationship, and it worked because neither of them required it to be more than what it was, and what it was had enough weight to carry its own meaning without elaboration. It enrolled at Gadsden State Community College in March, in the trades program, electrical, specifically, liked because he had discovered during the winter at the farm that he had an aptitude for wiring that expressed itself as something close to pleasure in a person who did not express pleasure often or obviously. Drove to Gadsden 3 mornings a week in the used truck Stephanie had helped him find in February for $4,000 he had saved from the county farm stipend, and 3 months of selling firewood at George White's store. Lived at the farm. He contributed to the utilities and did the maintenance work he had established as his domain over the winter. Ate dinner in the kitchen 4 nights a week, and the other 3 he cooked for himself or ate at a diner in Gadsden after class. The arrangement had the functional logic of something that had arrived at its own form without anyone designing it. Stephanie did not call it anything. She did not need to call it anything. It was what it was and what it was worked. Late February, Jeffrey Lewis called to apologize. I'd been doing a final clearance of Raymond Harris's personal safe deposit box at an Anniston bank, an item that had not been part of the initial estate processing because Raymond had not listed it with the estate documents and it had only come to Jeffrey's attention when the bank sent a notice to the estate address in November. Avigal had opened it in January and found, among other things, an envelope, sealed. Stephanie's name on the front in Raymond's handwriting. A note attached in Raymond's handwriting that read, "To be delivered 12 months after my death." Before. Raymond had died in July. 12 months was July of the following year. Jeffrey had been intending to hold the envelope accordingly, but the safe deposit box had not been opened until February. He had read the note again and decided that the instruction spirit, a private letter, of it at distance from the event, was better honored by delivering it now than by holding it to a calendar date Raymond had written before knowing when the box would be discovered. He mailed it to the farm. Kevin brought it in from the mailbox on a Thursday and left it on the kitchen table with the same economy he brought to everything. Here, this arrived, now it exists in the kitchen, and went back outside. Stephanie picked it up, recognized the handwriting. She did not open it immediately. She finished what she was doing, is updating the resource log on the inside of the cabinet door with 2 new entries she had found through the non-profit meeting. A legal aid clinic in Calhoun County that had recently expanded its rural services and a county health department mobile unit that made quarterly stops in Delwood and the surrounding area. Washed her hands. She made coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table with the wood stove going in the living room. It sounded familiar now, the way sounds became familiar when they had been part of your days for months. She opened the envelope. 8 pages. His handwriting smaller and more deliberate than the composition notebooks. This was not a man writing fast under pressure. This was a man who had sat down and thought about every sentence before he wrote it and had written it anyway. A different kind of courage than the notebooks. Quieter, more considered. He did not begin with apologies. He began with a specific morning, November 12, 1995, the delivery room at the Regional Medical Center in Anniston. He wrote, "Sandra's hand was cold and then she was laughing, and then you arrived angry, which was the correct response to arriving anywhere." He wrote about Sandra, at the night of the fire. He had written about that night in the birthday letters, and he did not repeat himself. He wrote about who she was before the fire, before the separation, the years when things between them had become too complicated for either of them to navigate without making it worse. He wrote about the red wool coat she had worn for 4 winters because she refused to replace something that was still working. He wrote about the night at Lake Chinnaby. He wrote, "I should have chosen better earlier. I know that. I am not writing this to explain my way out of it. I'm writing it because you deserve to know that she was remarkable and that you came from that." Then he wrote about the farm. He wrote, "The land does not belong to me, saying that in the practical sense, I came from it and I will go back into it eventually. But I mean it in the other sense too. The farm does not carry my name, it carries what people did with it. My grandfather opened it when people had nowhere else. My father did the same. I did it quietly, in the only way I could figure out how to, because it was the only language for that kind of care that I understood how to speak." He wrote, "I left it to you because you understand that language, not because I taught it to you. I did not get to do that, and I have to live with that wherever I am now. But because the same things that shaped me shaped you in their own way. Earl told you that you did not have a place in it. You kept finding one anyway. That is the same language." He wrote, "Keep what is useful, change what is not. The only thing that matters is that somebody is there to open the door. The rest you will figure out." She folded the letter along its original creases when she finished reading it. She held it in both hands for a while. Not long, long enough. The wood stove was going in the living room. The fire was the contained, working kind, not large, not decorative, just enough to heat the room. Kevin was in the barn. Donna was coming for dinner on Saturday. The Southfields soybean lease would need reviewing in August. The extension committee had a meeting in May she had agreed to attend. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet in the shape of the state of Alabama, is the drawing Becca had left behind when Amy Walker's 11 days were over. The farmhouse in crayon, green and brown and red brick and yellow windows, smoke coming from the chimney in a cheerful, optimistic loop that bore no resemblance to how wood smoke actually behaved, but that was, in its own way, exactly right. The sun was in the upper right corner. A pecan tree was a brown circle on a brown stick. There were flowers along the porch that did not currently exist. Stephanie looked at the drawing. She looked at the letter, looked at the window where the south field was going about its February business. She was not fixed. She was not healed. She had not arrived at a clean ending for the 21 years of a story she had been living without its full text. Like some of that story, she would be reading and rereading for the rest of her life, the same way you reread certain things. Not because you forgot them, but because they meant something different, depending on where you were when you came back to them. She put the letter in the composition notebook with Amy Walker's note and Ronald Clark's entry, and the dated record of everyone who had come through the farm since October. She closed the notebook, laid it on the shelf in the room below the kitchen, in the spot she had cleared for it between year 31 and the walnut box. Then she came back upstairs. She left the hidden door open behind her, as she had started doing, not closed and locked away, but accessible, part of the house, part of what the house held. Sharon Ramirez called on a morning in late April, with a question that turned out to be a referral. She had been talking to a non-profit organization that worked with rural landowners in Alabama, helping them understand county programs, navigate the registration systems, identify resources they were eligible for but not aware of. She had mentioned Stephanie's situation and the extension committee and the work she had been doing informally at the farm. The non-profit was interested in meeting. Sharon said, "I told them you would want to think about it." Stephanie said, "You were right, she did think about it. For a week she thought about it while doing the things that required doing. The March lease agreements on the farm's east acreage that she had signed with a local soybean grower, the first income the property had generated in 4 years, latest but real. The ongoing cataloging of Raymond's documentation, which she was now storing in acid-free archival boxes purchased from a conservation supply company in Birmingham. At least the composition notebooks were aging, and she was aware that paper had a lifespan, and she wanted this record to outlast hers. The meeting with the nonprofit was on a Tuesday in late April. The man she met with had been doing this work for 12 years and talked about rural land and county systems the way people talked about things they understood from the inside, with a specific shorthand that came from years of pattern recognition and with the patience for complication that came from knowing the complication was never going away. Stephanie said yes to the committee. She said yes with the awareness that yes meant a larger scope of involvement than she had been thinking about when she signed the extension renewal in January. The scope had a way of expanding in proportion to what you understood, and she understood more now than she had in October. And the farm was a thing that could carry more than she had originally calculated. Raymond had calculated exactly what he could manage alone and had managed it alone for 11 years. She was not going to make the same choice. Donna Jackson drove out to the farm on a Saturday in April. She came because Stephanie had invited her. Not for anything specific, just for dinner, and to see what the place looked like when the season turned and the worst of the winter was behind. She walked the property before dinner, the way a person walked lanterned, when they were thinking about something and using their feet to help think it. She stood under the pecan tree for a moment and looked at the bench that had sunk into the ground on one leg. It had been re-leveled by Kevin in February with a flat stone under the sinking leg, a practical solution done without discussion, just done. At dinner, pot roast, ate rice by Mermad. One of the things Raymond's cookbooks had taught Stephanie in the months she had been working through the shelf in the kitchen, like the stained and folded pages telling her which ones he had used. Donna looked around the kitchen with an expression that was not nostalgia. It was the look of someone checking something against an expectation and finding the check correct. "Like your father would be glad," Stephanie said. "I think he would have notes." Donna looked at her. Then she laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, short and genuine. She said yes, he absolutely would. Kevin, at the other end of the table, and conducting his usual policy of not contributing to adult conversation unless directly addressed, looked up briefly at the sound of Donna's laugh. Then he went back to his food with the expression of someone who had noted something down internally and was not going to say what it was. After dinner, While Donna was getting her coat, like she said, she had been talking to a colleague at the state extension office. There were 7 other farm properties in Calhoun County that had been registered under the Emergency Housing Protocol at some point in the previous 20 years. 5 of those registrations had lapsed. The owners had aged out or passed on or simply stopped renewing without knowing there was someone who would pick it up. 1 had been sold. She said the extension office had been looking for a way to revive those registrations. There was a committee forming. Stephanie said, "Okay." Donna said, "I said I knew someone who might be interested." Stephanie looked at her. Like she thought about Raymond signing that piece of paper every February for 11 years. She thought about the resource log on the inside of the cabinet door. I thought about Amy Walker's note in the composition notebook, and Ronald Clark's handshake at the door, and Becca asking Kevin about the skateboard in spring. She said, "Send me the information." Donna said she would. Put on her coat and drove back to Talladega in the dark. Stephanie washed the dishes. Kevin dried them without being asked, standing beside her at the sink with a dish towel, not saying anything. Which was how they had worked out most things in the 5 months since he arrived. Side by side, functional, the companionship not in the words but in the presence. One morning in late March, Stephanie had walked the fence line of the Harris farm from the northeast corner to the southeast corner, a route she had started doing on Saturdays because it was the best way to find what needed attention before what needed attention became an emergency. The fence ran along the timber edge on the eastern boundary. It then turned south along the creek. She could hear from the house on quiet mornings. She stopped at the southeast corner where the land rose slightly before it leveled out again at the boundary marker. From this rise, she could see the full eastern length of the property, the timber edge, the creek line, the back of the barn in the distance, the farmhouse beyond it with its straight roof line. She thought about Raymond standing here. But she thought about his father, his grandfather, 8 generations of Harris men who had looked at this ground and understood something about it that was not visible in any property survey but was visible in the extension agreement and the resource log and the 31 notebooks, and the walnut box with her name carved into the lid and the letter that was now in the new composition notebook on the shelf in the room below. Not feel them. She was not that kind of person. But she understood what they had passed forward, and she understood that she was standing in the position of the person it had been passed to, which was a position she had not applied for and had not been prepared for, and was learning the dimensions of in the same incremental way you learned any position that did not come with a manual. She was not all right, exactly, but still in the process of becoming all right, which was a different thing, slower and less linear and more honest. They still woke up sometimes at 3 in the morning with the particular weight of 21 years pressing on her chest, the specific gravity of what had been taken from both of them, from her and from Raymond, by a woman who had used the quietest possible methods to do a thing that could not be repaired now, only acknowledged and carried. But the farm was here. The door was open. The fire in the wood stove was doing its job. Walked back to the farmhouse along the fence line, checking the posts as she went. 2 on the south end needed attention before summer. She noted them on the paper she carried in her coat pocket. She was keeping a list. Raymond had kept lists. Understood now why. Not because the list was the point, but because the list was the evidence that you intended to keep going. I saw the next thing that needed doing and wrote it down rather than letting it disappear into the general difficulty of a day. She wrote down the fence posts. She put the paper back in her pocket. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. The stove was going. Kevin was at the table with his electrical coursework, diagrams, circuits, the specific visual language of systems that either worked or they did not, which appealed to him in ways that ambiguous situations did not. Not look up when she came in, which meant he was at a point in the problem that required uninterrupted attention. She hung up her coat. She filled the kettle. Outside, through the kitchen window, the south field was doing what the south field always did. Being the longest view on the property, running out past the fence line to where the timber started. The light was the particular quality of late March light in Alabama, not yet decided to be warm but had definitely decided to be longer, the afternoon lasting further into the evening than it had a month ago. The kettle came to a boil. She made coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Kevin, still working through his circuits. She opened the composition notebook to a blank page. She dated the top. She started writing the next list. There was a fence post on the south side that would need attention before the lease grower came in August. There was the extension committee meeting in May. There was Raymond's resource log on the inside of the cabinet door. They had been meaning to share with the county health department contact Donna had introduced her to, who was building a database of rural services for people in crisis situations who did not know what was available. There was the matter of the East Field drainage she had not yet fully worked out. There was, in other words, a working list, the kind that never reached its end because the end of one thing was the beginning of the next thing. That was not a problem. That was a farm. That was what it meant to be the person standing in the farmhouse with the door open and the fire going and the list in the notebook and the next thing already visible on the other side of the thing you were finishing. She wrote it all down. The coffee cooled beside her. Kevin turned a page in his coursework. The wood stove kept on with its work, and outside the south field held its ground in the late afternoon light, going about the quiet business of being land that had always known what it was for and was waiting, as it always had, for the person in the farmhouse to catch up.